I'm just we're going to be looking at the Gospels and Acts sort of as historical analysis of them. There are basically two main reasons why I think this is important. One, I think it's just important for us as Christians to know that there's actually like a historical backing for what we're reading in the Bible that's specifically talking about the four Gospels and Acts. It's also perhaps a better way to reach people who do not believe that they are inspired or think that they are just like myths made up or something. I got this slide, so I didn't make this slide. I got it from this came from a professor named Timothy McGrew from Western Michigan University, from a talk he did. So I'll be using it. And there's probably more material than we'll be able to get through. And also my laptop is not fully charged, so I'm not sure if I'll be able to make this all the way through. But there are basically two different approaches people can take when they are sort of defending the New Testament or the specifically the resurrection as a historical event. Some prefer a minimal facts approach. You can see this in the works of like Gary Habermas and also Michael Licona, who are both professors of New Testament and New Testament history. So what they do is basically argue that the resurrection is a historical event, and so they take basically standards that historians use to determine that something is actually historical rather than made up or a legend that gained over time. And so they do a minimal facts approach where they want to take the facts that are agreed upon by nearly all New Testament historians and classicists about the New Testament, and they make an argument for the resurrection from that. And this is a different approach. It's looking at like the maximum amount of data that we can find to sort of gain support for the entire Gospels as a historical work. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. We'll just skip past that one. So there's various different tests that you can apply to test the historical credibility of a work. So there's external tests. This is like maybe something being confirmed by a different author. It can be attributions of authorship. So if you have someone writing somewhere else that's basically giving testimony that, say, the Gospel of Mark is actually written by Mark, for example, that is an external test for the reliability of that authorship. Use in other works, so basically being quoted by other writers, shows basically gives you a time frame from when something was written. There's also internal tests. I've talked about undesigned coincidences before if you were here for that one, but we'll cover that kind of in this one, not really to the same extent. And then there's also just consistency among the books. So if you have multiple different accounts from different authors that are saying the same basic facts, that can provide credibility for that something is historical. All right, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So this comes from someone named Augustine, sometimes called Saint Augustine or Augustine of Hippo. He provides this sort of he's replying to someone who is basically challenging the authorship of the Gospels, saying they're not actually written by the people who they're attributed to. And he says, why does no one doubt the authenticity of the books attributed to Hippocrates? Because there is a succession of testimony to the books from the time of Hippocrates to the present day, which makes it unreasonable either now or hereafter to have any doubt on the subject. How do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? So what he's saying there is basically, we know Plato wrote his works. He was an ancient Greek philosopher, not necessarily because he said, this is Plato who's writing this, but because later writers all agreed that it was written by a man named Plato. And so we have the same thing for the Gospels that we have for other ancient works. He mentions Hippocrates in this, who is sort of like an ancient doctor who wrote, if you've ever heard of like the Hippocratic Oath that doctors have to take, that comes from him. There's basically an entire work of stuff that's attributed to him that's probably not written by him. So maybe Augustine's wrong on that point there, though. So as far as the Gospels, there's early attestation of the authorship by several different early Christian writers. So there's and the important thing about this is that these authors are not in the same place, and they also didn't have like text message where they could say, hey, they could text someone in a different country and tell them, hey, you should say Mark wrote this gospel, so that way we can team up and convince people 2,000 years from now that Mark wrote this gospel. So we have authors from in the early 2nd century, like Irenaeus, Papias, and Clement, basically attesting to the fact that the Gospels were written by the people who we traditionally attribute, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there are no other rival traditions of authorship, so it's not disputed by anybody for several hundred years about who wrote this. And this is important because a lot of critics of the Bible, like even professors who have studied this, will try to argue that the Gospels are actually anonymous. And the main reason they say that is because it doesn't specifically say, like Matthew will talk about himself in the third person. And we have other ancient writers do that in historical works as well. But there's no point in it where they actually say, like, this is Mark writing this by hand, and here I am in the story. So that's why they say it's anonymous. But compared to other works, we actually can be just as sure that it's written by the people that it's attributed to. So that is an external test. If you go to the next slide. Next slide after that. Yeah, those are the people I mentioned there. Next slide after that. Yeah, so the red part is what we just covered there briefly. And then go to the next slide. And here is further external evidence. Polycarp is another Christian writer that we have about early 2nd century. We have letters that he wrote to people. And he quotes or alludes to all of these books. So that's evidence that it's being circulated early on and not written after 108 or about 108. Go to the next slide. So they're actually, if you've ever like read the Da Vinci Code or heard anything about that, you will probably know about these so-called like other gospels. I even took a Bible class where the professor kind of tried to make a big deal about this, where he was like, actually, he didn't make a huge deal, but he did sort of make the students think that there was all these gospels flowing around and no no one really knew which ones were the real ones. The church just arbitrarily picked the 4 that they liked and then just banished the other ones. And this is like, these are, all those initials up there are early writers. And so this shows basically them using it early on. And you can see these other Gospels, which were written way later. And one of the evidence for that fact is that they weren't quoted at all in these early writers. And the 4 Gospels were. So that's, these check marks show where they're quoted by those authors. You can go to the next slide. So, yeah, we have overwhelming evidence of it. Overwhelming instances of the 4 Gospels that we have being used in other early church writings. So that's evidence for their historical veracity. Go to the next slide. So, and then another thing we have is integration. So we're not looking for non-Christian reports of the resurrection. That is kind of redundant. If you're looking for, so basically a non-Christian that believes Jesus resurrected is what we call a Christian. So that's kind of a weird category to look for. One of my professors actually said something like this to me. He was like, well, if we actually had a non-Christian that was writing saying, I saw Jesus alive again after he was crucified, that might actually be good evidence. And I was like, well, that's actually what we have. His name is Paul, and he became a Christian because he saw Jesus. If you expect someone to remain in unbelief after that, you're kind of looking for a crazy person, and then we should wonder why we would trust them. Anyway, so what we're looking for with integration is not saying necessarily the same things, but saying facts that fit with what we see in the Gospels, and that'll make more sense when we get to it. But basically, we can use other ancient writers to sort of understand what's going on in Jerusalem and Palestine at the time, and then we can say, well, do the Gospels sound like they know what's going on in this area, or do they sound like they're written by someone outside of this area from a different time period and they actually don't know what's going on? So some integration. I'll actually look up these. It is in Acts 25:21. All right, in verse 21, it just mentions, when Paul appealed to be held for trial by the emperor, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. So that actually mentions 2 different names, King Agrippa and Festus. Festus, the high priest. Agrippa was the king. So that's something that can be verified, like Josephus mentions both of those figures. Josephus is a Jewish historian who's writing in the 1st century, who was hired by Romans. The talk of Denarius and Luke 20 through 24. Show me a denarius whose image and inscription does it have? Caesar's, they said. And I should have included a photo. So I've actually looked at 1st century coins when I was at the British Museum, Roman coins. And so an important fact that they get here is that the denarius has an image of Caesar on it. I should have grabbed a photo to show that, but and then there's Archelaus mentioned in Matthew chapter 2, verse 22. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the region of Galilee. This is a really important fact. I think it'll mention it later on. So, yeah. Okay, it's going to mention that. That's a really important fact that sort of plays into an event that was going on at the time of why he would be afraid that Archelaus was ruling. But I'm going to go to the next slide. So in Luke 2, we were told that a decree was sent by Caesar Augustus prior to Jesus' birth, which is around 6 BC. It could possibly be a few years different from that. That's an estimation. It mentions 3 different Caesars in the New Testament. So Caesar Augustus and Tiberius Caesar, 2 different. And they ruled in 2 different time periods, and so it's important to notice that. So Luke and Acts is written by the same person, and they mention both of these people, and they get the time periods right relative to Jesus' life. And so if you're writing far after the fact and you don't have any reference material, that would be very hard to do. Go to the next slide. And then after Tiberius, you had Nero. But here's an image of the denarius, and that shows that Caesar is on there. And another important point is that Jesus, when he has them take a denarius, he says, "Give unto Caesar what's Caesar, and give unto God what's God's." And so Caesar's image is on the coin, but God's image is on humanity. And so that's kind of a point he was making. So he's probably smarter than the people who were trying to trick him into committing treason. And then if you go to the next slide, I already read that, so go to the next slide. So in Exodus 20, it says, "You shall not make for yourselves a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." And so, go to the next slide. The Caesar was actually viewed as a god by Romans. I don't really know if they actually thought that whoever was in charge was a god, or if they basically praised him like a god just to gain political power. It's not entirely clear, but basically, with that passage we find in Luke about rendering unto Caesar, he is essentially saying that Caesar actually isn't God, because if you go back a slide, basically you can't make any image of of anything from heaven on carved images. So if this would be blasphemy, actually, if Jews supported printing money of a person and calling them a god. So that's why the money actually belongs to Caesar, and you're supposed to render it unto him. But go to the slide after that. And after that one. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about with Archelaus, where Archelaus is reigning, place of his father Herod, and Joseph is afraid to go there. So he's warned in a dream to withdraw to Galilee. Go to the next slide. Yeah, so it makes sense why Archelaus would take the throne. He was the son of Herod the Great. If you just read Matthew, it's not entirely clear why he's actually afraid that Archelaus is ruling. But Josephus mentions an event that Archelaus did. If you go to the next slide. So after Herod died, Archelaus basically canceled Passover, and they ended up just killing like a mob of Jews. The Romans did. And so Archelaus, yes, if you go to the next slide. Yeah, he killed 3,000 Jews in the temple, and Passover was canceled that year. So, yeah, Joseph did not want to go to where he was ruling for sure. And that's not mentioned in the Gospels at all, but clearly they have knowledge of this, since they mentioned that Joseph didn't want to be under his rule. Go to the next slide. So basically we can use outside work to put some of what we read in the New Testament in context. If you're just reading that passage, you wouldn't understand why. Go to the next slide. The accuracy of Acts. This is a really important point. Luke gets so many tiny details right. And the important thing about Acts is that it covers a wide range of like geographical areas. So you can't just be. It would be easy for one person to get lots of details right about a certain area. If they lived there, they would know who's ruling that area. They would know what the culture's like. It would be very difficult to get many accurate details about a wide range of areas like we see in Acts, unless, of course, you actually travel there or you interview people who went there. You can't get on Google and look up who is ruling a certain city. So Colin Hemmer wrote the book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history. It's a very thick book. He lists 84 facts specifically from chapter 16 to the end of book of Acts that have been confirmed through historical and archaeological research. So either through other writers that we have like Josephus or Tacitus, who's a Roman historian, or archaeological research like stuff we've dug up that has certain people's names on it that has been verified, or that was mentioned in Acts. Local deities, certain things about how they would worship based off of sort of altars we dug up. So just listing through this stuff, right? Kind of quick. In Acts 13, he gets the governor of Cyprus. The official position is actually called a proconsul. And that word is only used for the position for the governor of Cyprus. It's not actually used for other leaders. And then he gets right in Acts 16, verses 20 through 22, he uses a different word for the governors of Philippi, which is called magistrates. And so the actual Greek word used is different there, and it was different for what they used in those places. So it's kind of it's not really clear how else he would get that information besides by being there directly or interviewing people that were there directly. And then in Thessalonica, which is in Acts 17, verse 6 and verse 8, it uses a different Greek word, which just means rulers. And then in Ephesus, it uses a different Greek word for the rulers, which means chief executive magistrate. So basically, he gets the right word for the rulers in all these different places, instead of just using the generic same word. And then, the ruler of Malta, which is called chief man, or protos. Then you can go to the next slide. There's a lot of allegations of errors that people make towards the Gospels that people basically try to argue that they've made certain mistakes, and some of these come from even like 20th century or late 19th century scholars who, based off of all the evidence they had at the time, did seem like errors, and then now that we've made certain archaeological advancements, we actually have confirmed certain things in Acts specifically. So there's here's 6 historical errors. Let me go. Allegation. Pass that one. Yeah. So the Gospels flip back between when they're referring to certain rulers as kings and governors. That's one thing. Reference to a high priest. At one point it mentions 2 high priests, but there was only 1 high priest, according to certain skeptics. John invents a landmark to make a metaphorical point. Nazareth didn't exist at the time of the 1st century. That point was popular like 20 years ago, basically arguing Nazareth didn't actually exist, that would be definitely a big bombshell if that were true. There were no synagogues in Capernaum in the 1st century. So what some people have argued, and people still make this argument that are scholars right now, is that there weren't synagogues in Capernaum, and Luke mentions a synagogue in Capernaum. And so what skeptics often say is that these didn't exist until after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. And so it's anachronistic by the author of the gospel, but we'll see that that's actually false according to stuff we've dug up. And Luke gets the date of the census under Quirinius wrong because he's trying to make up a reason why Jesus would be born in Bethlehem if he was from Nazareth. That's something that's alleged a lot. So you can just go past that. In Matthew 2, verse 22, Archelaus is reigning as king. And 27:2, Pilate is the governor of Judea, Herod is king of Judea, and Felix is governor of Judea. So it sort of alternates back and forth. It's Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense. He was an important figure in the American Revolution. He basically argued that the British were tyrants, and it was common sense that we should revolt against them or separate from them. He also wrote a book basically arguing for secularism or deism or atheism, and he made accusations against the Bible. So one of the things he said is there could be no such thing as a person of King Herod because the Jews in their country were under the dominion of the Roman emperors who governed then by tetrarchs or governors. And then there's Josephus, who I've mentioned. Next slide several times. 5 minutes. Okay, I'll try and wrap this up real quick here. Go to Matthew 2, or go to the next slide. Matthew 2, verses 22. Archelaus was a king, but that it doesn't actually say he was a king, but was reigning king, which means that he was actually put there by Caesar as the reigning king, so basically the acting king. And then if you go to the next slide, they basically agree. Josephus and Luke agree there was no time during the previous 30 years, nor ever afterward, when there was a king at Jerusalem, except the last 3 years of the life of Agrippa, where he was reigning king. And I'll probably won't be able to address all those alleged things, but we'll mention the two high priests. So Luke mentions two high priests, and that's often, there was only one high priest according to the Old Testament. So go past, there you go, one more. So in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, so it actually mentions two high priests. If you go to the Old Testament, it says there can only be one, so that's often, and you can only, if you go to the next slide, so it says, John 18, verse 13, first they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. So, go to the next slide. This comes from Robert Taylor, who was a scholar in the 19th century, who says, any person being acquainted with the history and polity of the Jews must have known that there was one high priest at the time. No Jew could have been ignorant that the high priest's office was not annual but for life. And so it just mentions Annas being a high priest for just 1 year. And then in Josephus, and so basically what that guy was arguing is this was written way later by someone who didn't know what they were talking about. Josephus mentions an antiquity of the Jews, you can go past this, that Annas had held the office of high priest from AD 6 through 15, but Pilate's predecessor had deposed him and then successively appointed and deposed one after another, including one of Annas' son, Joseph Caiaphas. His son-in-law was the fourth of these. So basically, what Josephus tells us is that Pilate was actually appointing high priests. So you can go past the next slide. So basically for a decade, Annas had power, and then also his 5 sons were appointed high priests as well. So Caiaphas would be one of those, and Caiaphas eventually took over. So there's that one resolved. And then I'll probably end on that. So do we have any prayer requests from Facebook? No? Okay. I'll go ahead and pray. Dear God, thank you for just letting us be able to meet here. Thank you for keeping us safe. We pray for all those that were on our prayer list that they would, you would watch over them and be with their health conditions, that you would heal them. And we just ask that you would help us to continue to learn about you and learn about the reasons for why we can trust what you've left for us in the Bible and why we can trust the Gospels. We thank you for your Son, Jesus, and what he did on the cross. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.